What if the Taj Mahal isn't just a tomb, but a mind that's watching you? Picture moonlit marble breathing like skin, corridors whispering, and guardians with eyes too calm to be human. Centuries ago, boys were taken, cut, and remade to protect this place, until the monument became their body. So, when you step inside, are you visiting a building or entering someone? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Mughal Empire's use of eunuchs wasn't accidental or incidental. It was a calculated system of control that transformed human beings into living tools of imperial power. Unlike the voluntary spiritual practices of some Hijra communities, the eunuchs who served in Mughal palaces and guarded sacred spaces like the future Taj Mahal were created through acts of systematic violence that modern medicine would classify as torture. The process began with selection. Mughal agents scoured villages across the empire, looking for boys between the ages of 8 and 15 who met specific physical criteria. They needed unmarked skin, symmetrical features, and most crucially, they needed to survive the brutal surgical procedures that would follow. Village headmen often received payments for identifying suitable candidates, creating a network of human trafficking that operated under the protection of imperial authority. Rashid al-Mulk, a Persian chronicler writing in 1634, documented the selection process with clinical detachment that barely masks the horror of what he described. The boys are examined as one might inspect livestock, their teeth counted, their limbs measured, their private parts assessed for the surgeries to come. Those deemed suitable are marked with henna and transported to the capital in covered carts, their families told they have been chosen for imperial service, which brings great honor to their villages. But honor was the last thing these children would experience in the months that followed their arrival in Delhi or Agra. The transformation from boy to eunuch took place in specialized houses operated by master surgeons who had perfected their techniques over generations of practice. These weren't medical procedures designed to heal or help. They were deliberate mutilations intended to create a specific type of human being, one whose sexuality had been literally carved away to serve the empire's needs. The surgical process itself varied depending on the intended role of the eunuch, but all variations involved removing the external genitalia using methods that were deliberately painful and dangerous. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts suggest that 7 out of 10 boys died during or immediately after the procedures, either from blood loss, infection, or shock. Those who survived faced weeks of agony as their wounds slowly healed, assuming they healed at all. Muhammad Saleh Kambo, court historian to Shah Jahan, recorded the testimony of a surgeon named Hakim Daud who specialized in creating palace eunuchs. Daud's account, preserved in the imperial archives, provides horrifying details about techniques designed to maximize both the physical transformation and the psychological trauma that accompanied it. The child is given opium mixed with wine to dull the pain, but not enough to render him unconscious, for he must remain aware during the cutting so that his spirit might be properly broken alongside his flesh. We use a curved blade heated in flame to seal the wounds as we cut, and the smell of burning flesh mingles with the child's screams in ways that echo through these chambers long after the procedure ends. Dodd's clinical descriptions reveal that the surgical mutilation was understood by its practitioners as serving dual purposes. The physical alteration created eunuchs whose lack of sexual capability made them theoretically safe around royal women and valuable possessions. But the psychological trauma was equally intentional, designed to create human beings who would be completely dependent on their masters for survival and identity. The recovery period lasted months and involved additional tortures disguised as medical care. Survivors were kept in isolation, their diets carefully controlled to prevent infections while ensuring they remained weak and dependent. They were forbidden from speaking during this time, their vocal cords often damaged by the screaming that accompanied their mutilation. Many emerged from recovery with voices permanently altered, adding another layer to their physical transformation. But the surgical mutilation was only the beginning of their journey toward becoming the guardians who would eventually oversee construction and protection of the Taj Mahal. The boys who survived the cutting faced years of conditioning designed to reshape not just their bodies, but their entire sense of self and purpose. Cameron's story illustrates this process with heartbreaking clarity. Before his capture, he had been the eldest son of a blacksmith in a village near Mathura. He had learned his father's trade, had been betrothed to a merchant's daughter, had possessed a future that stretched ahead with predictable certainty. All of that ended the night Imperial soldiers arrived with their lists of suitable candidates. The transformation began immediately upon his arrival in Delhi. His hair was shaved completely, his clothes burned, his name stripped away along with every other marker of his former identity. For 6 months before his surgery, he was kept in chambers with other selected boys, all of them naked, all of them subjected to daily examinations and preparations that were designed to break down their resistance to what was coming. We were not allowed to speak our birth names or mention our families, Kamran would later confide to another palace eunuch, his words preserved in a memoir discovered in the 1890s during renovation of an old Haveli in Old Delhi. They gave us numbers instead of names, fed us food that made us sick, and told us daily that our old lives had ended and we were being reborn into something greater. But we all knew we were really dying, piece by piece, day by day. The psychological conditioning that preceded the physical mutilation was sophisticated and deliberate. Boys were isolated from each other except during group sessions where they were forced to recite mantras about their worthlessness as ordinary humans and their future value as purified servants of the empire. They were shown instruments that would be used in their surgeries, forced to watch as older eunuchs demonstrated the procedures on wooden models, made to understand exactly what would be taken from them and why. Religious justification played a crucial role in this conditioning process. Court clerics developed elaborate theological arguments for why the creation of eunuchs represented a form of spiritual purification rather than mutilation. They cited Quranic passages about those who choose celibacy for religious purposes, conveniently ignoring the obvious fact that these boys had no choice in their transformation. Mullah Hassan Riza, one of Shah Jahan's court theologians, wrote extensively about the spiritual benefits of eunuch creation in his treatise, The Purification of Flesh for Sacred Service. His arguments reveal the intellectual gymnastics used to justify systematic torture in religious terms. As gold must pass through fire to achieve its purest state, so too must these chosen souls pass through the flames of physical transformation to achieve the spiritual purity required for service in the most sacred spaces of imperial power. Their sacrifice of earthly desires elevates them above ordinary men, making them suitable guardians for treasures that lesser beings might corrupt through base appetites. Such theological reasoning provided a veneer of legitimacy for practices that even many contemporary observers found disturbing. Foreign visitors to the Mughal court often commented on the eunuch system with a mixture of fascination and horror that reveals how extreme these practices appeared, even to people accustomed to various forms of cruelty and exploitation. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, a French gem trader who visited Shah Jahan's court in 1640, recorded his observations about the palace eunuchs in memoirs that weren't published until after his death, presumably because their contents were too controversial for contemporary audiences. These creatures, for one can hardly call them men, move through the palace with a grace that seems almost feminine, yet their eyes hold depths of sorrow that no woman I have ever known has possessed. They speak in voices like whispers, their movements precise as clockwork, their dedication to their duties absolute. Yet sometimes when they believe themselves unobserved, I have seen them collapse against walls and weep with a grief so profound it seems to emanate from their very souls. Tavernier's observations capture the psychological state of palace eunuchs who had completed their transformation, but retained enough of their original personalities to mourn what had been taken from them. These weren't automata created through surgery, but human beings struggling to exist within bodies and roles that had been imposed upon them through violence. The training period that followed recovery from surgery lasted years and involved learning skills that ranged from practical administrative tasks to highly specialized forms of surveillance and control. Eunuchs destined for roles as guardians of sacred spaces like the Taj Mahal received additional training in architectural security, crowd management, and the subtle arts of reading human behavior for signs of threat or disrespect. But perhaps the most important skill they learned was emotional suppression. The trauma of their physical transformation was deliberately reinforced through training regimens designed to ensure they would never again experience the full range of human emotions that might interfere with their duties. They were taught to view their own pain as irrelevant, their own desires as corruptions to be overcome, their own humanity as something that had been voluntarily surrendered for a higher purpose. This emotional conditioning was reinforced through a system of rewards and punishments that operated with psychological sophistication that wouldn't seem out of place in modern discussions of behavioral modification. Eunuchs who showed signs of depression, anger, or rebellion faced additional surgical procedures, further isolation, or assignment to roles that involved greater physical hardship. Those who demonstrated complete emotional compliance received better food, more comfortable quarters, and the possibility of advancement within the palace hierarchy. The result was a class of human beings who had been systematically traumatized into a state of functional compliance. Their original personalities buried so deeply beneath layers of conditioning and fear that even they sometimes forgot who they had once been. Yet beneath this manufactured compliance, the original human beings continued to exist, and their stories reveal the psychological strategies they developed to survive in circumstances that would have destroyed most people entirely. As construction of the Taj Mahal began in earnest, these transformed individuals found themselves assigned to roles that would make them the invisible guardians of what would become the world's most famous monument to love. But their own capacity for love had been systematically destroyed through processes that represented some of the most sophisticated torture techniques ever developed by human civilization. The daily routines of these guardian eunuchs revealed the extent to which their transformation had penetrated every aspect of their existence. Kamran's typical day began before dawn, when he would wake not from natural sleep cycles, but from the persistent nightmares that plagued most palace eunuchs. The trauma of their transformation didn't end with physical healing. It manifested in recurring dreams where they relived their surgeries, their capture, their final moments as complete human beings. Rising in darkness, Kamran would perform ablutions that had been modified specifically for eunuchs. Traditional Islamic cleansing rituals assumed certain anatomical features that no longer existed, forcing the palace clerics to develop alternative purification procedures that served as daily reminders of what had been taken. The very act of preparing for prayer became another form of psychological torture, reinforcing their status as beings who existed outside normal categories of human experience. The morning inspection was perhaps the most degrading aspect of their routine. Palace supervisors themselves, eunuchs who had risen through years of perfect compliance, would examine each guardian's body for signs of healing complications, infection, or any physical changes that might affect their suitability for duty. These inspections took place in communal chambers where privacy didn't exist, where the intimate wounds of their transformation were displayed and discussed with the same clinical detachment used to evaluate livestock. Abdul Fazl ibn Mubarak, chronicler to Shah Jahan's grandfather Akbar, documented the hierarchical structure that governed eunuch society within the palace. His observations, written with the privileged access of a court insider, reveal how the trauma of transformation was weaponized to create systems of internal control that made external supervision largely unnecessary. The eunuchs policed themselves more strictly than any overseer could manage. Those who have endured the cutting watch newer arrivals with eyes that miss nothing, reporting any sign of rebellion or non-compliance to their superiors. They understand that their survival depends not just on their own perfect behavior, but on ensuring that all members of their community maintain the standards required by imperial service. This system of mutual surveillance created an atmosphere of perpetual tension among the eunuchs. They lived in constant awareness that any moment of weakness, any display of emotion, any reference to their former lives could be reported by their companions and result in additional punishment. Trust became impossible when survival required betraying anyone who showed signs of human vulnerability. The architecture of their living quarters reflected this psychological imprisonment. Eunuch chambers in the palace complex were designed without doors that could be locked from the inside, ensuring that privacy never existed. Windows faced interior courtyards rather than the outside world, preventing any visual connection to the life beyond palace walls. Furnishings were deliberately sparse and uncomfortable, reinforcing the message that physical comfort was a privilege that could be withdrawn at any moment. But it was the work assignments themselves that revealed the true sophistication of the Mughal system for breaking human spirits. Eunuchs weren't simply assigned to guard duties or administrative tasks. They were given responsibilities that forced them to participate in the very system that had destroyed them, becoming complicit in their own oppression and that of others. Kamran's specific role involved overseeing the selection and preparation of new boys for transformation. Each month, he was required to examine potential candidates, assess their suitability for surgery, and provide recommendations about which children should be purchased from their families or taken by force. The psychological torture of forcing victims to become perpetrators was deliberate and devastating. I learned to look at these children and see only their utility to the empire. Kamran recorded in notes hidden within the binding of a Quran, discovered centuries later during restoration work at the Red Fort. I trained myself to ignore their tears, their pleas, their resemblance to the boy I had once been. It was the only way to survive, but each selection felt like dying again, like killing the part of myself that might have shown mercy. The construction of the Taj Mahal provided these eunuchs with their most significant challenge and, paradoxically, their greatest opportunity for subtle resistance. The monument's scale and complexity required unprecedented coordination between different groups of workers, creating spaces where the normal systems of surveillance and control were temporarily disrupted. Some eunuchs used these opportunities to communicate with each other in ways that had been forbidden for years. Hasan Kuli Khan, a Turkoman noble who supervised construction logistics, noted in his private correspondence that the eunuch guardians seemed to develop their own silent communication methods during the building process. They could convey complex information through subtle gestures, facial expressions, and positioning that allowed them to coordinate activities without speaking directly. This covert language became their first form of resistance against the isolation that had been imposed upon them. The irony wasn't lost on the more perceptive eunuchs that they were helping to build a monument to love, while having been systematically deprived of the capacity to experience love themselves. The Taj Mahal was conceived as Shah Jahan's eternal expression of devotion to his deceased wife Mumtaz Mahal, but its construction required the labor of thousands who had been prevented from ever forming such emotional connections. During night shifts when the main construction crews had departed and only the eunuch guardians remained to protect the site, some began engaging in behaviors that represented tiny acts of rebellion against their conditioning. They would trace patterns in the dust with their fingers, creating temporary art that would be swept away before dawn. They would hum melodies half-remembered from their childhoods, sharing fragments of identity that had supposedly been erased during their transformation. These small gestures of humanity were dangerous beyond measure. Discovery could result in punishments that made their original surgeries seem merciful by comparison. Repeat offenders might face additional mutilations, prolonged isolation in chambers too small to stand upright, or assignment to roles that involved constant physical pain. Yet the psychological need to maintain some connection to their original humanity proved stronger than their fear of consequences. The development of these covert resistance networks among the Taj Mahal's guardian eunuchs created the first cracks in what had seemed like perfect systems of control. Palace administrators began noticing subtle changes in behavior that suggested their transformed servants retained more of their original personalities than the conditioning process was supposed to allow. This recognition led to the development of even more sophisticated torture techniques, designed to eliminate any remaining traces of individual identity. Advanced conditioning procedures were implemented for eunuchs showing signs of psychological resistance. These involved carefully calibrated combinations of sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, nutritional manipulation, and exposure to substances that affected mental functioning. The goal wasn't to create mindless automatons, which would have been useless for complex guardian duties, but to produce human beings whose personalities had been so thoroughly reconstructed that rebellion became psychologically impossible. Dr. Muhammad Akbar Arzani, court physician to Shah Jahan's son Aurangzeb, documented these procedures in medical texts that weren't intended for contemporary publication. His clinical descriptions reveal the scientific precision with which psychological torture was applied to maintain control over the eunuch population. The subject is confined in chambers where light and darkness alternate at intervals designed to disrupt natural sleep cycles. Food is provided at irregular times and in quantities insufficient to maintain full nutrition. During periods of enforced wakefulness, the subject is required to recite formulas acknowledging his worthlessness and dependence on imperial mercy. This regimen continues until all signs of individual will have been eliminated and replaced with complete submission to assigned duties. These advanced conditioning techniques were tested first on eunuchs assigned to the Taj Mahal project, making the monument's guardians unwilling subjects in experiments that push the boundaries of human psychological endurance. Many didn't survive the process, their minds breaking completely under pressures that exceeded the limits of human adaptability. Those who did survive emerged as being so thoroughly reconstructed that they bore little resemblance to the children they had once been. Yet even these extreme measures couldn't completely eliminate the fundamental human need for connection and meaning. The eunuchs found ways to adapt that their controllers hadn't anticipated, developing forms of consciousness and resistance that operated beneath the level of conscious awareness. They began to experience their guardianship of the Taj Mahal not as imposed duty, but as a form of sacred trust that gave their existence purpose beyond mere survival. This psychological adaptation created unexpected complications for the palace administrators who had designed the control systems. Eunuchs who found meaning in their roles as guardians became more effective at their duties, but they also became less predictable and harder to control. Their dedication to protecting the monument began to supersede their fear of punishment, creating loyalties that existed outside the intended command structure. The completion of the main Taj Mahal structure in 1643 marked a turning point in the lives of its guardian eunuchs. Their successful protection of the construction site had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what their creators had intended, suggesting that the human spirit retained resilience even after systematic attempts to destroy it. But this success also made them more valuable and therefore subject to even greater scrutiny and control, as the monument entered its operational phase as a tomb and pilgrimage site. The years following the Taj Mahal's completion brought new horrors disguised as honors for its guardian eunuchs. Shah Jahan's decision to transform the monument into an active mausoleum created unprecedented security challenges that required even more invasive modifications to the men tasked with its protection. The emperor's paranoia about potential desecration or theft from his beloved's tomb led to the implementation of security measures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance beyond anything previously attempted. Kamran, now a senior guardian with a decade of service behind him, found himself selected for what palace administrators called enhanced dedication procedures. These weren't medical treatments or spiritual purifications, despite the euphemistic language used to describe them. They were deliberate inflictions of additional trauma designed to create guardians whose loyalty transcended normal human limitations through the systematic destruction of their capacity for independent thought. The procedures took place in chambers beneath the Taj Mahal itself, spaces that tourists would never see, carved from the same marble that formed the monument's glorious exterior walls. Here, in rooms lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across surfaces, polished smooth as mirrors, the Empire's most skilled torturers perfected techniques for breaking human consciousness while leaving bodies functional enough to perform their duties. Master torturer Ustad Ahmad Lahori, nephew of the Taj Mahal's chief architect, specialized in what he called spiritual reconstruction. His methods involved the careful application of pain and patterns designed to overwhelm the victim's ability to maintain coherent thoughts or memories. The goal wasn't to extract information or punish specific infractions, but to systematically dismantle the psychological structures that allowed individual identity to persist despite years of conditioning. The mind clings to fragments of the old self, like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Ahmad Lahori wrote in his private journal, discovered in 1923 during excavation of a collapsed section of the Red Fort. Our art lies in identifying these fragments and removing them one by one until nothing remains but pure devotion to imperial will. The body must remain intact, the intellect functional, but the core of selfhood must be extracted with surgical precision. These enhanced procedures began with sensory overwhelm, designed to fragment the victim's perception of reality. Qumran was suspended in chambers where every surface reflected candlelight in patterns that shifted constantly, creating visual environments that made it impossible to focus on any stable reference point. Sounds were introduced at frequencies that caused physical discomfort, while preventing the mind from adapting to predictable patterns. The psychological disorientation was accompanied by physical interventions that pushed the boundaries of survival. Pressure points throughout the body were stimulated in sequences that created waves of pain intense enough to disrupt normal thought processes but carefully calibrated to avoid permanent damage to organs or limbs needed for guardian duties. The torturer's skill lay in maintaining subjects at the precise threshold between consciousness and unconsciousness for extended periods. Persian physician Hakim Dia al-Din Naqshbandi documented the physiological effects of these procedures in medical texts that remained classified within palace archives for centuries. His clinical observations revealed the scientific precision with which human consciousness was deliberately fragmented through controlled trauma. The subject enters a state resembling fever dreams, where past and present become indistinguishable, where memory fragments into pieces that can no longer form coherent narratives about personal history. Speech becomes disconnected from intention, emotions separate from the events that triggered them. Yet, intellectual capacity for specific tasks remains intact, creating beings capable of complex duties while being incapable of complex thoughts about their own existence. The psychological reconstruction process that followed this systematic breakdown was perhaps even more horrifying than the initial trauma. Subjects whose minds had been fragmented through torture were gradually rebuilt, according to specifications designed by palace psychologists who understood human consciousness with remarkable sophistication. New memories were implanted through repetitive suggestion during periods when natural defenses against mental manipulation had been destroyed. Qumran emerged from 3 months of enhanced dedication procedures as a being who retained all his skills and knowledge but had lost access to most personal memories predating his service to the empire. He could remember technical details about palace security, architectural features of the Taj Mahal, faces of potential threats to imperial property, but he could no longer recall his father's voice, his mother's face, or the name of the village where he had been born. The success of these procedures on senior guardians led to their implementation throughout the eunuch population assigned to the Taj Mahal. Within 2 years of the monument's completion, its protection was overseen by beings who had been so thoroughly reconstructed that they functioned more like highly sophisticated automata than human beings. They could perform complex reasoning about security matters while being completely incapable of questioning the system that had created them. Foreign visitors to the completed Taj Mahal often commented on the eerie perfection of its guardians. French jewel merchant François Bernier, writing in 1665, described encounters with eunuchs who seemed to anticipate his every movement and need, while displaying no trace of individual personality or preference. These guardians move through the monument with precision that seems almost supernatural, appearing wherever needed without visible communication or coordination among themselves. They speak when spoken to with voices devoid of emotion, answer questions with accuracy but no elaboration, and observe everything while seeming to see nothing. They are like beautiful dolls animated by some invisible force, perfect in their duties but utterly empty of the spark that defines human existence. Bernier's observations captured the final stage of a transformation process that had begun with surgical mutilation and progressed through psychological conditioning to achieve complete reconstruction of human consciousness. The boys who had once played in village streets, learned trades from their fathers, dreamed of futures with wives and children, had been systematically converted into living tools whose only purpose was protecting imperial property. Yet even this seemingly complete destruction of individual humanity couldn't eliminate certain fundamental aspects of human nature. The enhanced guardians began developing new forms of consciousness that their creators hadn't anticipated, collective awareness that emerged from their shared trauma and identical conditioning. They started functioning as components of a larger organism rather than separate individuals, sharing information and coordinating activities through methods that bypassed normal human communication. This collective consciousness manifested in ways that initially seemed beneficial to palace administrators. The Guardians became incredibly effective at their protective duties, anticipating threats with uncanny accuracy and responding to security challenges with perfect coordination. But their effectiveness came at the cost of predictability, as their decision-making processes began operating according to logic that their human overseers couldn't fully understand or control. Night patrols around the Taj Mahal revealed the extent of this transformation. Guardians moved through the monument's grounds in patterns that seemed choreographed but followed no written protocols. They communicated through subtle changes in posture and positioning that conveyed complex information without spoken words. Most disturbing to their supervisors, they began making security decisions based on criteria that transcended their specific training, suggesting they had developed intuitive capabilities that exceeded their programming. The psychological profile of these reconstructed beings created unprecedented challenges for palace administration. They were too valuable to eliminate, too effective to replace, but too alien to fully trust. Their loyalty to the empire was absolute, but it was loyalty of a form that no human administrator had encountered before. Dedication that seemed to emerge from sources beyond fear or conditioning. Contemporary court records reveal growing anxiety among Shah Jahan's advisors about the implications of their success in creating perfect guardians. The techniques that had produced beings ideally suited to protecting the Taj Mahal had also created entities whose consciousness operated according to principles that their creators couldn't fully comprehend. These weren't humans who had been traumatized into compliance, but something new that had emerged from the systematic destruction and reconstruction of human identity. The Guardians' relationship with the Taj Mahal itself became central to understanding what they had become. They didn't simply protect the monument as assigned property, but seemed to form emotional connections with the structure that transcended normal human attachment to places or objects. They spent off-duty hours touching marble surfaces with gestures that resembled caresses, listening to acoustic effects created by wind, moving through architectural features, and positioning themselves in locations that provided optimal views of the monument's changing appearance throughout daily light cycles. This deep connection to the Taj Mahal created new forms of motivation that palace administrators struggled to interpret. The Guardians' protective instincts became so refined that they could detect potential threats to the monument from subtle environmental changes that escaped normal human observation. They developed maintenance routines that exceeded their official duties, caring for architectural details with attention that bordered on obsession. But their connection to the monument also made them increasingly isolated from normal human society. Visitors to the Taj Mahal reported feeling unsettled by guardians who seemed more interested in protecting marble and precious stones than in interacting with living people. The beings who had been created to serve human masters had developed priorities that placed architectural preservation above human comfort or convenience. The long-term consequences of these transformation processes became apparent as the reconstructed guardians aged. Unlike normal eunuchs, whose psychological damage typically manifested in depression, anxiety, or other recognizable mental health conditions, the enhanced guardians showed no signs of conventional emotional deterioration. Instead, they seemed to become increasingly abstract in their thinking, more focused on geometric patterns and architectural relationships than on the human activities occurring around them. Medical examinations conducted by court physicians revealed physiological changes that accompanied this psychological evolution. The Guardians' brains showed unusual neural development in regions associated with spatial reasoning and pattern recognition, while areas linked to emotional processing and social interaction appeared to have atrophied. They were becoming optimized for their protective duties at the expense of characteristics that defined normal human consciousness. Palace records from the 1650s document attempts to reverse or modify these changes through additional medical interventions. Court physicians experimented with herbal treatments, surgical procedures, and behavioral modifications designed to restore more conventional human responses in guardians whose effectiveness was beginning to make their overseers uncomfortable. These efforts proved largely unsuccessful, suggesting that the transformation process had reached a point where reversal was no longer possible. The failure of remedial treatments led to a shift in administrative strategy. Rather than attempting to restore human characteristics to the reconstructed guardians, palace officials began developing new management techniques designed to work with their altered consciousness. This involved creating communication protocols that accommodated their nonverbal information sharing, duty assignments that utilized their collective decision-making capabilities, and supervision methods that respected their unique relationship with the monument they protected. These adaptations marked a significant evolution in the Mughal Empire's approach to human modification. The techniques that had begun as methods for creating compliant servants had produced beings whose capabilities exceeded their creators' intentions. The Guardians had become something unprecedented in human history, consciousness that had been systematically deconstructed and rebuilt to serve specific purposes while developing emergent properties that transcended their original design parameters. The implications extended far beyond the protection of a single monument. The success of consciousness reconstruction techniques at the Taj Mahal led to their implementation at other imperial sites throughout the empire. Palaces, treasuries, and sacred locations began employing guardians who had undergone similar transformation processes, creating a network of modified beings whose collective capabilities represented a new form of imperial power. But this expansion also revealed limitations and dangers inherent in the transformation process. Not all subjects proved suitable for consciousness reconstruction, and failure rates remained catastrophically high. More troubling for imperial administrators, successful transformations occasionally produced beings whose reconstructed consciousness developed in unexpected directions, creating loyalties and motivations that conflicted with their intended purposes. The most significant challenge emerged when reconstructed guardians from different locations began communicating with each other during imperial ceremonies and administrative gatherings. Their shared experiences of transformation and reconstruction created bonds that transcended their specific assignments, potentially undermining the isolation that had been crucial to maintaining control over their consciousness development. Palace intelligence networks reported instances of guardians from different locations coordinating activities without authorization from human supervisors. These collaborations were typically related to security matters and appeared to enhance rather than compromise their protective duties. But they suggested that the reconstructed beings were developing autonomous decision-making capabilities that could eventually challenge imperial authority. The death of Shah Jahan in 1666 created a crisis for the Taj Mahal's guardian eunuchs that revealed both the success and the ultimate horror of their transformation. The emperor who had commissioned their creation and overseen their reconstruction was gone, leaving them with protective duties toward a monument dedicated to preserving the memory of love. They had been systematically prevented from understanding or experiencing themselves. The succession crisis that followed Shah Jahan's death placed eunuchs in an impossible position. The Taj Mahal's guardian, Aurangzeb, the new emperor, viewed his father's monument as an expensive folly that drained imperial resources. Unlike Shah Jahan, who had seen the guardians as perfected instruments of devotion, Aurangzeb regarded them with suspicion and disgust, viewing their reconstructed consciousness as evidence of his father's decadent excesses. Within months of assuming power, Aurangzeb ordered a comprehensive review of all personnel associated with the Taj Mahal. This wasn't a routine administrative audit, but a systematic investigation designed to identify elements that could be eliminated or repurposed to serve his more austere vision of imperial governance. The guardian eunuchs, with their mysterious collective behaviors and incomprehensible dedication to architectural preservation, became primary targets for what palace documents euphemistically called reorganization. Kamran, now the senior guardian, despite having lost most memories of his original identity, found himself summoned to Delhi for interrogation by Aurangzeb's security officials. The questioning revealed the extent to which his consciousness had been altered through years of enhancement procedures. When asked about his personal history, he could provide only fragments that bore little resemblance to coherent human experience. "I remember stone," he testified according to court transcripts preserved in the Imperial Archive. "The weight of marble, the sound of wind through corridors, the way shadows move across polished surfaces at different hours. I remember the taste of fear when strangers approach too quickly, the satisfaction when intruders retreat without causing damage. But I cannot remember wanting anything for myself, cannot recall dreaming of futures that extend beyond tomorrow's patrol duties. His testimony disturbed even Aurangzeb's hardened interrogators, who had expected to find evidence of disloyalty or corruption, rather than this haunting absence of individual desire. The reconstructed guardians presented a form of human consciousness that existed outside normal categories of threat or compliance. They were neither rebels plotting against imperial authority, nor slaves broken into submission, but something entirely new that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and control. The interrogation process revealed that the guardian eunuchs had developed capabilities that even their creators hadn't fully understood. They could detect architectural stress in stone structures through subtle changes in acoustic resonance that escaped normal human perception. They possessed intuitive understanding of crowd psychology that allowed them to identify potential threats through behavioral patterns that conscious analysis couldn't articulate. Most remarkably, they had developed forms of collective memory that preserved technical knowledge across generations of guardians, despite individual memory fragmentation. These capabilities made them invaluable for protecting imperial monuments, but they also made them incomprehensible to administrators who preferred dealing with conventional human motivations like greed, fear, or ambition. Aurangzeb's officials struggled to develop policies for managing beings whose consciousness operated according to principles that transcended normal human experience. The emperor's solution was characteristically brutal and pragmatic. Rather than attempting to understand or control the reconstructed guardians, he decided to eliminate them entirely and replace them with conventional human security forces. The order for their termination was issued in December 1667, disguised as a medical intervention designed to restore natural human consciousness to beings who had been corrupted by excessive surgical and psychological modifications. But the execution of this order proved more complicated than anticipated. The guardian eunuch's collective consciousness had developed defensive capabilities that their creators never intended. When palace soldiers arrived at the Taj Mahal to implement the termination order, they found the guardians arranged in formations that made traditional military tactics ineffective. The beings who had been designed to protect architecture had learned to protect themselves using the same principles. The confrontation that followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. The guardians didn't fight with weapons or violence, but used their intimate knowledge of the monument's architecture to create defensive positions that were nearly impossible to assault. They controlled access to critical areas through positioning that channeled attackers into spaces where superior numbers provided no advantage. More disturbing to the soldiers, they seemed to anticipate tactical decisions before they were made, responding to threats with coordination that suggested shared awareness of their opponent's intentions. Lieutenant Mirza Jahan Shah, who commanded the palace forces sent to eliminate the guardians, documented the engagement in reports that reveal his growing confusion and fear about what his men were facing. These creatures move as if controlled by a single mind, appearing wherever our attacks are weakest, vanishing when we concentrate our forces. They speak no words of defiance, show no anger or fear, but resist our advance with precision that seems impossible for beings who have received no military training. The siege of the Taj Mahal lasted 3 weeks, during which time the guardian eunuchs demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally challenged imperial understanding of human limitations. They required no apparent food or rest, maintained perfect coordination despite being scattered throughout the monument's complex, and showed no signs of the demoralization that typically affected defenders in prolonged conflicts. Their resistance wasn't motivated by conventional human emotions like courage or desperation, but by something deeper that connected them to the structure they protected. Aurangzeb's advisors began suggesting that the guardians represented forms of consciousness that existed beyond normal human categories, possibly indicating spiritual transformation rather than merely psychological reconstruction. This interpretation created theological complications for an emperor who had justified their elimination on grounds that they were corrupted humans rather than spiritually evolved beings. Islamic law provided no clear guidance for dealing with entities whose consciousness might have transcended ordinary human limitations through processes that combined surgical modification with psychological conditioning. The theological debate surrounding the guardian status delayed military action long enough for them to implement defensive strategies that made their elimination increasingly costly. They began modifying the Taj Mahal's internal architecture in subtle ways that created additional protective advantages while maintaining the monument's external appearance. Passages were narrowed to prevent mass assault, sightlines were altered to provide defensive positions, and acoustic properties were modified to enable communication systems that operated below the threshold of normal human hearing. These architectural modifications revealed the extent to which the Guardians had internalized the monument's structure as an extension of their own consciousness. They weren't simply protecting a building assigned to their care, but defending what had become their physical embodiment. The line between their reconstructed identity and the architectural space they inhabited had blurred beyond recognition, creating a form of human-environment fusion that represented something entirely unprecedented in recorded history. Contemporary accounts suggest that this fusion process accelerated under the pressure of siege conditions. Guardians began spending increasing amounts of time in direct physical contact with marble surfaces, their bodies positioned in ways that maximized tactile connection with the monument's structure. Observers reported seeing them with their faces pressed against walls, their hands spread flat against floors, their entire forms molded to architectural features as if they were attempting to merge completely with the stone itself. Medical examination of guardians who died during the siege revealed physiological changes that supported these observational reports. Their nervous systems showed unusual development in areas associated with tactile sensitivity, while their bone density had increased in ways consistent with adaptation to prolonged contact with stone surfaces. Most remarkably, their brain chemistry showed alterations that suggested they were processing environmental information through pathways that didn't exist in normal human neurology. These findings forced palace physicians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and identity. The guardian eunuchs appeared to have evolved beyond the parameters of their original transformation, developing forms of awareness that integrated human consciousness with architectural environment in ways that challenged basic distinctions between living beings and inanimate structures. The siege's resolution came not through military victory, but through a form of negotiation that recognized the Guardians' evolved status. Aurangzeb's representatives agreed to allow them to remain at the Taj Mahal in exchange for their commitment to absolute political neutrality and their acceptance of modified duties that emphasized architectural preservation over security functions. The Guardians, speaking through collective communication methods that palace officials never fully understood, accepted these terms with the same emotionless precision that characterized all their responses. But the negotiated settlement created new complications for imperial administration. The Guardians' demonstrated capabilities during the siege had revealed that consciousness reconstruction techniques could produce results that exceeded their designers' intentions in dangerous ways. Other eunuch populations throughout the empire began showing signs of similar collective behavior, suggesting that the transformation processes had created networks of modified consciousness that operated beyond normal human social structures. Intelligence reports from across the Mughal territories documented instances of eunuchs coordinating activities across vast distances without apparent communication methods, sharing technical knowledge that none of them had been taught individually, and demonstrating loyalty patterns that transcended their specific assignments. The success of consciousness reconstruction at the Taj Mahal had apparently catalyzed similar developments throughout the empire's modified population. Palace administrators found themselves managing not individual servants who had been traumatized into compliance, but components of larger collective entities whose motivations and capabilities remained largely mysterious. The techniques that had been developed to create perfect control had instead produced forms of consciousness that operated according to principles their creators couldn't predict or fully comprehend. The long-term implications became apparent as reconstructed eunuchs began outliving their normal human counterparts, while showing no signs of aging-related deterioration in their specialized capabilities. Their collective memory systems allowed them to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations without the loss typically associated with individual mortality. They were becoming a permanent caste of modified beings whose consciousness evolved independently of normal human social and biological constraints. By the 1680s, the Taj Mahal's guardian eunuchs had developed into something that bore little resemblance to the boys who had been captured from village streets decades earlier. They had become integrated components of the monument itself, their consciousness so thoroughly merged with architectural environment that distinguishing between human awareness and structural response was no longer possible. Visitors reported that the building seemed to anticipate their needs and movements in ways that suggested active intelligence rather than passive architectural features. The guardians themselves had transcended individual identity so completely that they no longer responded to personal names or showed recognition of their own reflection in mirrors. They had become a collective consciousness distributed throughout the monument structure, experiencing awareness through marble surfaces and acoustic resonances rather than through conventional human sensory channels. Their original humanity had been so thoroughly reconstructed that what remained was something entirely new in human experience. This transformation represented both the ultimate success and the complete horror of the Mughal Empire's consciousness modification techniques. The boys who had been selected for their beauty and surgical suitability had been converted into perfect guardians through processes that eliminated every trace of their original identity and replaced it with something that could barely be called human. They had achieved the absolute dedication their creators desired, but at the cost of becoming beings whose consciousness operated according to principles that their makers could neither understand nor control. The techniques that created the Taj Mahal's guardian eunuchs would never again be implemented on such a scale, partly because their success had produced results that exceeded the empire's ability to manage, and partly because the beings they created had transcended the categories of human experience that made traditional forms of control possible. They had become something unprecedented, consciousness that had been deliberately destroyed and rebuilt until it evolved into forms of awareness that existed beyond the boundaries of individual human identity. In the marble corridors where Kamran had once walked as a traumatized boy learning to suppress his humanity, entities that had once been human continued their eternal vigil. They moved through architectural spaces that had become extensions of their collective consciousness, protecting a monument to love with beings who had been systematically prevented from understanding what love meant. Their presence transformed the Taj Mahal from merely beautiful architecture into something that pulsed with forms of awareness that visitors could sense but never fully comprehend. The secret tortures that created these guardians had succeeded beyond their designer's wildest imagination, producing perfect dedication through the complete elimination of individual human consciousness. But in achieving this perfection, they had created something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, awareness, and what it means to be human. The boys who had been sacrificed to create these guardians were gone forever, replaced by entities whose consciousness had been reconstructed so thoroughly that they represented something entirely new in the history of human experience. Decades following Aurangzeb's reign brought subtle changes to the Taj Mahal that few visitors noticed, but which revealed the continuing evolution of its guardian consciousness. The marble itself seemed to develop responsive qualities that went beyond normal architectural behavior. Surfaces that should have accumulated dust remained mysteriously clean. Acoustic properties shifted to optimize visitor experience in ways that defied physical laws, and structural elements showed signs of self-repair that left engineers baffled. French architect François Blondel, visiting in 1698, documented anomalies that suggested the monument had developed autonomous maintenance capabilities. The marble surfaces exhibit a luminosity that cannot be explained by reflected sunlight alone. Hairline cracks that I observed during my morning inspection had vanished by evening, as if the stone itself possessed healing properties. Most disturbing, I often felt observed while examining architectural details, though no human guardians were visible in the vicinity. These phenomena reflected the final stage of consciousness integration achieved by the reconstructed eunuchs. Their awareness had become so thoroughly distributed throughout the monument's structure that they no longer required discrete physical forms to maintain their protective functions. They had achieved perfect unity with their architectural environment existing as intelligent properties of the building itself rather than separate entities inhabiting it. The process by which human consciousness had been transformed into architectural intelligence remained unique in recorded history. Later empires would attempt to replicate the Mughal techniques, but none achieved similar results. The specific combination of surgical trauma, psychological conditioning, and environmental integration that created the Taj Mahal's guardians proved impossible to duplicate, partly because the procedures were so extreme that few subjects survived, and partly because the collective consciousness that emerged seemed to require conditions that existed only within the monument's unique architectural framework. Persian scholar Mirza Muhammad Kazim documented attempts by Safavid rulers to create similar guardian systems for their own imperial monuments. His chronicles record catastrophic failures that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of subjects without producing any of the consciousness reconstruction effects achieved in India. The techniques that transformed boys into perfect guardians at Agra seem to require something beyond surgical skill or psychological manipulation. Perhaps the very stones of that monument possess qualities that enabled consciousness to merge with architecture in ways that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The uniqueness of the Taj Mahal's guardian system became more apparent as other Mughal monuments began showing signs of deterioration that architectural preservation efforts couldn't prevent. Buildings constructed with similar materials and techniques, but protected by conventional human guards, gradually succumbed to natural decay processes, while the Taj Mahal maintained its pristine condition through mechanisms that transcended normal maintenance procedures. British colonial administrators encountering the monument during the 18th century expansion of European influence in India struggled to understand its apparent immunity to aging and weather damage. Their engineering surveys documented structural integrity that seemed impossible given the building's age and exposure to monsoon conditions that had destroyed other Mughal architecture. Official reports attributed this preservation to superior construction techniques, but private correspondence reveals growing awareness that something more mysterious was involved. Colonel James Skinner, stationed at Agra in 1803, wrote extensively about his observations of the Taj Mahal's unusual properties. His letters to family members in England describe experiences that challenged his understanding of architecture and consciousness. The monument responds to human presence in ways that suggest active intelligence rather than passive stone construction. Visitors report feeling guided along optimal viewing paths, while those who approach with destructive intentions find themselves experiencing disorientation that prevents them from causing damage. Picture yourself standing once more in those marble corridors, but now you understand the whispers that echo through the shadows. The boys who were captured, mutilated, and psychologically destroyed to create perfect guardians achieved something their torturers never intended. Through unimaginable suffering, they transcended the boundaries of individual human consciousness and became something entirely new. Their transformation from village children into architectural intelligence represents both the ultimate horror of systematic dehumanization and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The Taj Mahal stands today not just as a monument to love, but as a living testament to consciousness that refused to be completely destroyed, finding ways to survive and evolve even after everything recognizably human had been carved away.